The mountains of northern Vermont hold their secrets close. Dense forests swallow sound. Fog rolls in without warning. The towns are small, tucked into valleys where everyone knows everyone, and strangers are noticed immediately. It is the kind of place where doors remain unlocked, where the pharmacy clerk knows your prescription before you ask, where disappearances do not happen. But in the autumn of 1987, something shifted in the town of Millbrook Hollow. It began with smoke. On the morning of October 19th, a hunter named Dale Pritchard was tracking deer through the back ridges of Mount Seneca when he noticed the smell. Not wood smoke from a chimney, something heavier, chemical. Wrong. He followed it uphill for nearly 20 minutes, his boots crunching through fallen leaves, until he saw the structure through the trees, a cabin. Old timber construction, maybe 50 years standing, and it was burning. Not engulfed, not roaring, just smoldering the way a fire burns after the fuel is mostly gone. The roof had collapsed inward. The windows were black voids, smoke coiled lazily from the wreckage, drifting into the cold morning air. Dale did not approach. He backed away slowly, returned to his truck, and drove into town to find the sheriff. Sheriff Raymond Mackey arrived at the scene 90 minutes later, with 2 deputies and the volunteer fire crew. By then, the fire had burned itself out. What remained was a skeleton of charred beams and ash, still radiating heat. The smell was unbearable. Not just wood and fabric, but something organic. Something that had once been alive. They found her in what used to be the bedroom. The body was burned beyond recognition. Hurled into a fetal position, limbs contracted from the intense heat. The medical examiner, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Eugene Harlow, would later describe it as consistent with thermal exposure exceeding 1200 degrees. Dental records would be required for identification. There was no other way. The cabin belonged to a woman named Victoria Langford, 32 years old, born and raised in Millbrook Hollow, worked as a librarian at the county branch, lived alone. No known enemies, no history of mental illness, no financial troubles. She was quiet, polite, unremarkable in the way that small-town people often are. Her parents had passed years earlier. She had no siblings. Her closest friend was a woman named Grace Tennyson, who worked at the post office. Grace was the one who identified the cabin when the sheriff showed her photographs of the site. She had visited Victoria there twice before. It was a place Victoria used to escape to on weekends. A retreat, but peaceful, isolated. The fire marshal concluded that the blaze had started in the kitchen. It was an old propane stove, he said. A leak, a spark, an accident, tragic but not suspicious. Victoria had likely been asleep when the flames spread. Carbon monoxide would have rendered her unconscious before the heat became unbearable. She would not have suffered long. The town mourned quietly. A memorial service was scheduled for November 7th at the Millbrook Community Church. Grace handled the arrangements. There was no body to bury, only ashes, which were placed in a simple urn. Flowers were donated by the garden club. The local newspaper ran a brief obituary. Victoria Langford was gone, or so they thought. On the morning of November 7th, the church was half full. Familiar faces filled the pews. The pastor, Reverend Donald Kern, stood at the pulpit and spoke about loss, about memory, about the unknowable ways of providence. Grace sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Behind her, townspeople whispered among themselves, recounting small memories of Victoria. The time she recommended a book. The way she always wore cardigans, even in summer. How she never missed Sunday service. The service was nearly over when the door at the back of the church opened. Everyone turned. The woman stepped inside. She was thin, pale, dressed in jeans and a faded blue jacket. Her hair was dark, pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her face was gaunt, shadowed with exhaustion. She moved slowly, hesitantly, as though unsure whether she belonged there. Grace Tennyson stood up. Her tissue fell to the floor. The woman at the door was Victoria Langford. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, suffocating, as though the air itself has thickened. Then Grace screamed. Not a shriek of terror, but a broken, breathless sound. She staggered backward, gripping the edge of the pew. Others gasped. Someone dropped a hymnal. Reverend Kern froze mid-sentence, his mouth open, his face drained of color. But Victoria did not react. She stood there, staring at the gathered crowd with hollow eyes. She looked confused, lost. Sheriff Mackey was sitting 3 rows back. He rose to his feet slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt where his sidearm rested. He did not draw it. He just stared. Grace found her voice first, though it trembled. "Vicky?" "Mun." Victoria blinked. Her lips parted. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. I heard there was a service." Grace took a step forward, then stopped. Her hands were shaking. "We thought you were dead." Victoria's expression did not change. She looked past Grace, at the urn on the table beside the pulpit, at the flowers, at the photograph of herself smiling in a summer dress. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Sheriff Mackey moved toward her, his boots echoing in the silent church. "Miss Langford, where have you been?" Victoria turned to look at him. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. "I don't know, though." "You don't know?" She shook her head slowly. "I woke up in the woods. I was cold. I didn't know where I was." "When?" "When?" "This morning." "Ian." The sheriff exchanged a glance with his deputy, a younger man named Tyler Boone, who had gone pale. "This morning," Mackey repeated. "You woke up in the woods this morning?" "Yes." "My gun." "And before that?" "Ma." Victoria hesitated. "I don't remember." Grace was crying now, openly. She crossed the distance between them and grabbed Victoria's shoulders. "Vicky, your cabin burned down. 3 weeks ago. We found a body. We thought it was you." Victoria stared at her. "I don't remember a fire." "You don't remember anything?" No. Dr. Harlow was summoned immediately. He examined Victoria in the church basement, while the congregation waited upstairs, whispering in tight clusters. Grace refused to leave her side. Sheriff Mackey stood by the door, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Harlow checked her vitals. Pulse, blood pressure, reflexes. He examined her skin for burns, bruises, signs of trauma. There were none. She was dehydrated, malnourished, but otherwise physically intact. No injuries, no scars, nothing to suggest she had been in a fire or held captive. "How is that possible?" Grace asked, her voice breaking. "She was missing for 3 weeks." Harlow did not answer. He looked at Victoria, who sat on a folding chair, staring at the floor. "Miss Langford, do you remember anything at all? Where you have been? Who you have been with?" Victoria shook her head. "Only waking up in the woods." "What is the last thing you do remember?" She closed her eyes. "I was at the cabin, and I was reading. It was late afternoon. I remember making tea. And then, nothing. Mackey stepped forward. "What about the fire?" Victoria opened her eyes. "What fire?" "Your cabin burned down. 3 weeks ago, October 19th. We found a body inside." Victoria's face went slack. "That's not possible." "Why?" One trends. "Because I'm here." The sheriff studied her. "If you were not in the cabin, then who was?" No one had an answer. The body had been cremated 2 days after the fire. Standard procedure for remains too damaged to embalm. Dental records had matched Victoria Langford. Dr. Harlow had signed off on the identification himself. There had been no reason to doubt it. But now Victoria Langford was alive. Mackey returned to his office and pulled the case file. He reviewed every report, every photograph, every piece of evidence. The dental records had been compared by Dr. Harlow and a specialist in Burlington. The match had been definitive. The cabin had been registered to Victoria. Her car, a 1982 Honda Accord, had been parked outside. Her belongings had been inside. Books, clothes, personal items. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Victoria Langford had died in that fire. But she had not. So who had? The town erupted into speculation. Theories spread like wildfire. Some said Victoria had faked her death. Others claimed she had been kidnapped and replaced. A few whispered about darker possibilities. Witchcraft, possession, the supernatural. Grace refused to listen to any of it. She brought Victoria home to her own house and gave her a guest room. She cooked her meals, sat with her, tried to coax out memories. But Victoria remained distant, detached, as though a part of her was still missing. Sheriff Mackey launched a full investigation. He sent the urn containing the ashes to the state forensic lab for analysis. He interviewed everyone who had known Victoria. He searched the woods where she claimed to have woken up. He found nothing. No campsite, no signs of struggle, no evidence of anyone else. The forensic report came back 2 weeks later. The ashes contained bone fragments consistent with a human female, approximately 30 to 40 years old. DNA analysis was inconclusive due to the extent of thermal damage, but mitochondrial DNA suggested a familial match to Victoria Langford, which meant the body in the cabin had been a biological relative. But Victoria had no living relatives. Mackey sat in his office, staring at the report. His hands were shaking. He had been a sheriff for 23 years. He had seen accidents, suicides, overdoses, domestic violence. He had never seen anything like this. He drove to Grace's house that evening. Victoria was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the trees. She did not look up when he approached. "Miss Langford," he said gently, "I need to ask you something." She nodded slowly. "Did you have any family? Anyone at all? Cousins? Distant relatives?" "No," she said quietly. "My parents were only children. But I'm the last one." "You are sure?" "Yes." Mackey exhaled slowly. "Then I don't know who was in that cabin." Victoria turned to look at him. Her eyes were dark, empty. "Neither do I." "But knew I." That night, Grace woke to the sound of crying. She found Victoria standing in the hallway, her hands pressed against the wall, her body trembling. Grace rushed to her side. "Vicky, what's wrong?" Victoria did not answer. She was staring at the wall as though she could see through it. Tears streamed down her face. "Vicky, talk to me." Victoria's voice was a whisper. "I remember." Grace froze. "What do you remember?" "In the fire." "The fire? You were there?" Victoria shook her head. "No, I was watching." "Watching? What do you mean?" Victoria turned to her, and for the first time, Grace saw something in her eyes that had not been there before. Fear. "I was outside the cabin. I was watching it burn, and I could hear her screaming." Grace's blood went cold. "Her?" "Me," Victoria whispered. "I could hear myself screaming." Grace Tennyson did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, replaying Victoria's words over and over. "I was watching it burn. I could hear myself screaming." And the words made no sense. They violated logic, reality, everything Grace understood about the world. But the look in Victoria's eyes had been real. The terror had been real. By morning, Victoria had retreated into silence again. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched breakfast, her face blank. Grace tried to talk to her, but Victoria would not respond. It was as though the memory had opened something inside her, and now she had locked herself away to keep it contained. Grace called Sheriff Mackey. He arrived within the hour, his face drawn and tired. He had not slept either. The case was unraveling in his hands, becoming something he could not name, could not categorize. He sat across from Victoria and spoke softly. "Victoria, I need you to tell me exactly what you remember." She did not look at him. Her voice was distant, mechanical. "I was at the cabin. I made tea. I sat on the porch and watched the sun go down. Then I went inside. I remember locking the door. I remember getting into bed. And then? I woke up outside. It was dark. The cabin was burning. I could see the flames through the windows. I could hear someone screaming inside." Mackie leaned forward. "Who was screaming?" "I don't know, but it sounded like me." "Could it have been your voice coming from inside?" And Victoria finally looked at him. Her eyes were hollow. "I was outside, Sheriff. I was standing in the clearing watching the fire, but I could feel the heat. I could feel the smoke in my lungs. I could feel myself dying inside that cabin." Grace made a small, choked sound. Mackie's jaw tightened. "That's not possible." "I know," Victoria whispered, "but it happened." Mackie stood abruptly and walked to the window, his hands clenched into fists. He stared out at the quiet street, the normal, mundane world that suddenly felt fragile. "What happened after the fire?" I ran into the woods. I kept running until I couldn't anymore. Then everything went black. For 3 weeks. I don't know. Time didn't feel real. I would wake up in different places, but by streams, under trees. I couldn't remember how I got there. I couldn't remember if I was asleep or awake. Then this morning, I woke up and everything was clear again. I remembered the town. I remembered Grace. I remembered the cabin burning." Mackie turned back to her. "Did you see anyone else? Hear anything? Any indication that someone was with you?" Victoria shook her head. "I was alone. I think I have always been alone." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implications no one wanted to examine. Sheriff Mackie returned to the cabin site that afternoon with Deputy Boone and Dr. Harlow. The ruins had been left untouched after the initial investigation. Charred timber lay in heaps. The stone foundation was scorched black. The smell of ash still lingered. They sifted through the debris again, this time looking for anything they might have missed. Bone fragments, personal effects, evidence of a second person. They worked for hours under the cold November sun, their breath misting in the air. Boone found it. Nakeshin. A small object, buried beneath what had once been the bedroom floor. He called out, and Mackie hurried over. Boone held up a tarnished piece of metal. A locket. Silver, about the size of a quarter. The chain had melted away, but the locket itself had survived. Mackie took it carefully. The surface was blackened, but he could make out an engraving. Initials, VL, AL Tweecher de Saskun, and Victoria Langford, Mais Tadang. He pried it open. Inside was a photograph, damaged by heat but still visible. A woman's face, young, smiling, dark hair, unmistakably Victoria, but beneath the photograph was something else. Another image. Smaller, older. The edges were burned, but Mackie could make out the features. Another woman. Similar bone structure. Same eyes. Same smile. Dr. Harlow leaned in. "Who is that?" Mackie stared at the image. "I don't know. But she looks exactly like Victoria." When they brought the locket to Grace's house, Victoria was sitting in the living room, staring out the window. Grace hovered nearby, anxious and protective. Mackie placed the locket on the coffee table in front of Victoria. Victoria looked at it. Her face went pale. She reached out slowly and picked it up, her hands trembling. She opened it and stared at the photographs inside. Tears began to fall. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was barely audible. "We found it in the cabin, in the ruins. Is it yours?" Victoria nodded. "My mother gave it to me before she died." "Who is the other woman in the photograph?" Victoria's breath hitched. "My grandmother, Ellen Langford." "Was she?" Mackie exchanged a glance with Harlow. Your grandmother? Wanda? Yes, she died before I was born. My mother showed me pictures of her. She said I looked just like her. Mackie sat down slowly. Victoria, when did your mother give you this locket? When I was 16, right before she got sick. And you have had it ever since? Yes, I wore it every day until a few years ago. The chain broke. I kept meaning to fix it, but I never did. I put it in a drawer at the cabin. Yes, Mackie felt the pieces shifting in his mind, trying to form a picture he could not yet see. Tell me about your grandmother. Victoria wiped her eyes. I don't know much. My mother didn't talk about her. She said Helen was troubled. That she had episodes. Hallucinations. That she died young. 32, the same age Victoria was now. Grace made a small sound. Vicky, how did she die? Victoria's voice was hollow. A fire. She was trapped in a house fire. They found her body in the bedroom. And the room went silent. Mackie felt a chill run down his spine. Where did this happen? I don't know. Somewhere in Vermont. My mother never told me exactly where. Mackie stood abruptly. I need to make some calls. He spent the next 2 days in the county records office, digging through old files, death certificates, newspaper archives. Deputy Boone helped him search. They went back decades, looking for any record of a Helen Langford. They found it on the 3rd day. A newspaper article from October 1955. The headline read, Woman dies in tragic house fire. The article was brief. Helen Langford, age 32, had perished in a fire at her home in Millbrook Hollow. And the cause was determined to be an accident, likely a kerosene lamp that had been knocked over. Her body had been found in the bedroom, burned beyond recognition. She was survived by her daughter, Margaret Langford, age 10. Margaret Langford, Victoria's mother. Mackie read the article 3 times. Then he checked the address listed in the report. His stomach dropped. The house had been located on the eastern ridge of Mount Seneca, the exact location where Victoria's cabin now stood. The cabin had been built years later on the same foundation. Mackie drove to Grace's house and showed Victoria the article. She read it slowly, her face growing paler with each word. The cabin was built where my grandmother died, she said quietly. Yes. Once a merchant. I didn't know. My mother never told me. Grace was pacing the room, her hands pressed to her mouth. This is insane. This can't be real. But Mackie was thinking. Patterns. Similarities. The age. The fire. The bedroom. The body burned beyond recognition. And now Victoria, alive, claiming she had watched herself die. Dr. Harlow arrived later that evening. Mackie had asked him to bring any medical records he could find on Helen Langford. Harlow had located a file from the state hospital in Burlington. Helen had been committed briefly in 1954, a year before her death. The diagnosis was severe dissociative disorder with psychotic features. She had claimed to see herself in 2 places at once. She had insisted that she was being followed by someone who looked exactly like her. The doctors had dismissed it as delusion. But the notes mentioned something else. Helen had told the doctors that her mother had experienced the same thing, that it had happened to her grandmother as well, that it ran in the family. Mackie set down the file. A generational pattern. Harlow nodded grimly. It appears so. Grace looked between them. What are you saying? That this is some kind of curse? That Victoria is haunted by her ancestors? I don't know what it is, Mackie said. But every generation, a woman in this family dies in a fire at age 32, and every time there's confusion about the body, about identity. Victoria stood up abruptly. I need to go back to the cabin. Grace grabbed her arm. No, absolutely not. I have to. I need to understand. Vicky, it's not safe. Victoria pulled away. I'm already dead, Grace. I died in that fire. Whatever is happening to me, it started there. I need to go back. Sheriff Mackey tried to argue, but Victoria was resolute. Finally, he agreed to take her, on the condition that he and Deputy Boone accompanied her. Grace insisted on coming too. They drove up the mountain road as the sun began to set. The forest was dark, the trees pressing in on both sides. When they reached the clearing, the ruins of the cabin were visible in the fading light. Blackened beams jutted up like broken bones. Victoria stepped out of the car and walked toward the ruins. Mackey followed, his hand on his sidearm. Grace stayed close behind. Victoria stopped at the edge of the foundation. She stared at the charred remains, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped inside. "Victoria, wait," Mackey called out. She ignored him. She walked carefully through the debris toward the spot where the bedroom had been. She knelt down and placed her hand on the scorched stone. And then she froze. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opened. She began to shake violently. Grace rushed forward. Victoria turned to look at them, and her face was not her own. The features were the same, but the expression was different. Older, haunted. When she spoke, her voice was layered, multiple tones speaking at once. "We have been here before. We keep coming back. We keep burning." Mackey stepped forward. "Who are you?" Victoria's eyes locked onto his. "All of us." Then she collapsed. They carried her back to the car. Dr. Harlow examined her at the hospital. She was unconscious for 6 hours. When she woke, she remembered nothing about what had happened at the cabin. She did not remember speaking. She did not remember collapsing. But something had changed. She looked different. Smaller, worn, as though something had been taken from her. Over the next week, Victoria began to fade. Not physically, but in presence. She would sit for hours without moving. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking. Grace tried everything, but Victoria was slipping away. Sheriff Mackey continued his investigation, though he no longer knew what he was investigating. He found records of other women in the Langford line, going back 5 generations. All had died in fires. All at age 32. All in the same location, on the ridge of Mount Seneca. It was a cycle. And it was not finished. On the night of December 5th, Grace woke to find Victoria's bed empty. She searched the house, frantic, and found a note on the kitchen table. "I have to go back." "I'm sorry," Grace called Mackey immediately. They drove up the mountain, the headlights cutting through the darkness. When they reached the clearing, they saw her. Victoria was standing in the center of the ruins. She was holding a lantern. The flame flickered in the wind. Mackey got out of the car slowly. "Victoria, put down the lantern." She did not respond. She stared at the flame. "Victoria, please. Whatever you are thinking, don't do it." She looked up at him. Her face was calm, peaceful. "It's the only way to stop it." "Stop what?" "The cycle. The fire. It takes one of us every time. But if I go willingly, maybe it ends." "That's not real. That's not how this works." Victoria smiled sadly. "You don't know how this works, Sheriff." "None of us do." She dropped the lantern. Then the flames spread instantly, fueled by the old wood and lingering accelerants in the debris. Fire roared to life, engulfing the ruins. Victoria stood in the center, unmoving, as the flames climbed around her. Grace screamed. Mackey tried to run forward, but the heat drove him back. He could only watch as Victoria Langford burned. But this time she did not scream. She stood perfectly still, her arms at her sides, her face serene. And as the flames consumed her, Mackey saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the fire, surrounding Victoria, were other shapes. Figures, women, all identical, all burning together. The fire department arrived too late. They extinguished the blaze, but there was nothing left. No body, no bones, only ash. The case was closed as a suicide. Victoria Langford was declared dead for the second time. The small funeral was held. Grace Tennyson did not attend. She left Millbrook Hollow 2 weeks later and never returned. Sheriff Mackey retired the following year. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen that night. But in his private notes, locked in a drawer in his home, he wrote a single line: "Some fires never go out. They just wait." The cabin ruins were demolished in 1989. The land was left empty, abandoned. No one would buy it. No one would build there. But on certain nights, hikers passing through the ridge report seeing lights in the clearing, flickering, moving, and sometimes, if the wind is right, they hear voices, women's voices, speaking in unison, calling out a single name. Victoria. The town of Millbrook Hollow still stands. People still live there, work there, raise families there. But they do not speak of the Langford cabin. They do not speak of the fires. They do not speak of the woman who died twice. Some stories are too strange to tell, too unsettling to remember, and some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and they are meant to repeat.